Tonight is my full moon video, and unfortunately, I have to do it alone without my author, Greg Bowe. The moon is in Taurus, headed into Gemini, and I had a daughter who was a Taurus, and she was murdered by bikers, Outlaws and Renegades, in 2017, along with 5 other of my kids in 2 states, all on the same day at the same time. And people all the time on Facebook tell me to forget about the murders, but I never will. My entire family has been murdered 5 times since I was born. And one time, since before I was born, my mother's entire family was murdered at Christmas Day at church. And the kids they missed at church, they went and murdered them at their homes. Doing things like riding bicycles in their own yards. I'll never forget about the murders of my family, and they're all politically motivated. I own Bottomline Publishing in New York on Broadway. It's an ASCAP BMI publishing company. And DuPont and McMahon stole that trademark Bottomline with Webster, the FBI director at the time. And Webster was funding my school system. And prior to Webster funding my school system, Hoover funded my school system. And I get people on Facebook all the time telling me to forget about these murders, and I never will, because none of the hitmen have ever gone to jail. And the bikers who murdered 5 of my kids as I sat in L Brooks Patterson's office in 2017, while he was still alive, they were all selling drugs with state policemen. And I know this because I bought a farm from the Czar. And the day I moved onto the farm, there were kids overdosed on heroin, cocaine, LSD. And these were young kids, 3, 5, 7 years old. So I called the FBI and they hung up on me. And I told the police that the farm I had purchased had drug dealers living behind me. And it turned out it wasn't just a drug trade in Utica, Michigan. It was the Senate gun and drug trade. And they stopped Noriega, and the Pope gave him a sanctuary in the Vatican. And they murdered my judge, 3 attorneys, another judge, and 2 of my doctors as I stopped this drug trade run by the Senate. And then the world got Oliver North as my uncle, who drove tanks with Patton in World War II, died of liver cancer. And the world got Oliver North, and he was born in Michigan. And he operated tanks for 8 years in World War II. Bush put Hitler into power, Prescott Bush. And another Bush was making Hitler's uniforms and parachutes and selling him chemical weapons in Greene County, Tennessee. He employed 3 cities in Greene County, Tennessee, making Hitler's uniforms throughout World War II. And there's no lie in this. 3 of my wives were murdered on a Civil War ranch I owned in Greene County, Tennessee. And prior to all of this, I worked with Putnam, George Washington's family, which is also my family. Bob Seger's musicians, and other famous people at electrical design and control, and we built robots for the auto companies, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors. And Lee Iacocca was my neighbor, and so was John DeLorean. And when I was in jail, they tried to frame John DeLorean for selling cocaine, and he wasn't. And Lee Iacocca's son-in-law was selling drugs from the drug dealers on the property I had just bought from Mr. Mazar. And Giles had set me up with Mr. Mazar. As the world got We Need Dirty Laundry from Jay Giles' band. And my band was on the radio prior to Jay Giles. But my friends and my own brother replaced me in a business I made, Bottomline Publishing and Advertising, and my band with a guy who died a week later. And when they did that, they didn't realize that the guy that built the bar we were playing in, and we were on the radio because of that guy in Madison Heights. Gene was his name. I had worked for Gene when I was 3 years old, and he was delivering milk on a Twin Pines truck my father made. And they didn't realize, because I never told them, that I was becoming a publisher in New York at ASCAP and BMI. And I would meet with Elvis Presley's publisher and the Mills brothers, Stan Mills, and they offered me quite a lot of money not to renew my publishing license just before 9/11, because they had already planned 9/11. And all of this is truth. The Twin Towers were built on Pratt Street. Mr. Pratt cut my father's hands off with a Mr. Behringer at a company called Divco. And I was kidnapped by Osborne and Anderson and Wallace and Long and Darrell Hall and tortured for gay sex. And then they murdered my identical twin. And my mother told me all my life. I had a brother who was deceased, and I wouldn't remember him, but I did remember him because he came back to kindergarten with Sirhan's kid from California, and I hadn't seen him in a year. And then he disappeared, and his body showed up in Pennsylvania. He was dismembered, raped, and murdered by the people who kidnapped he and I. And I find it really interesting that Osborne kidnapped and tortured and raped me, Ed and Gary Osborne. And their mother was in the house, and Mac Osborne has lived with Judith Barry Baker her entire life since the murder of JFK. And Mac Osborne was Lee Harvey Oswald's bunkmate in the military. I find all of this beyond coincidence. And I'm the Baker family. I was Ava Gardner's family. She married Mickey Rooney and Frank Sinatra. And Osborne, he would wash the kids he raped. Then he'd torture us and rape us. and then he washes again. And that's exactly how my twin was found in Pennsylvania. And the FBI funded my school systems and stole my trademark Bottomline with Weiner and Associates and DuPont. And I find it very, very curious that Jackie Kennedy died on a horse DuPont owned after DuPont killed wrestlers on his farm. And I knew all the wrestlers on the radio, like Leaping Larry Shane, and in Florida, Dick the Bruiser. He lived with his mother. I really knew all these wrestlers. So DuPont created the WWF with McMahon, and they stole my trademark, Bottomline, and had Bottomline events with Steve Austin. And the state policemen, where the renegades and outlaws would buy drugs on his farm, he would brag about murdering innocent people, and he was my father-in-law. And his first wife was with Jimmy Hoffa when Hoffa disappeared. And the FBI came to me in my work truck and tried to tell me I murdered Hoffa because I had bought a car from Whitey. And his wife had introduced me to Whitey. And that state policeman had dug a hole in Michigan with a crane. And then they filled the hole in as they stole my horse. I had just bought a horse and they stole the horse. And I believe they put the horse on top of Jimmy Hoffa's body. And I've made other videos about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance, and I calling the FBI about dismembered, murdered kids carried across state lines, and they hang up on me. And I have witnesses to this. And there are witnesses in my videos on Facebook who were in my home as I called the FBI, and they hung up on me 5 times when I tried to report murdered kids in Oakland County, Michigan, the Oakland County child killings. And L Brooks Patterson, his family's kid, Theodore Oglesby, he was my friend, and his mother was Mrs. Patterson. And I told him in 9th grade, 10th grade, that his father was in the driveway where my twin was murdered. And he never filed my twin's murder report. Well, he was going to talk to his uncle, L Brooks Patterson, about that. And the night he talked to him, he was found hung in a jail cell. So I believe that L Brooks Patterson hung his own nephew in an Oakland County jail cell. And he collected $25 million a year for 67 years until his death in taxpayer money, and never solved the crimes. And he was in the driveway where Osborne murdered my twin. And I've had 4 wives murdered in Greene County, where Bush made Hitler's uniforms. And I'm President Jackson's family. And George Washington left my family his sword. And I worked with Putnam, who is my family. And George Washington married Putnam. As I worked with Bob Seger's musicians. And 2 of my wives on the Civil War ranch in Greene County, I was set up on at a price I couldn't refuse. I replaced Armstrong, the family that was on the moon, and my uncle Flayton put Armstrong on the moon at NASA. Two of my wives were murdered on that Civil War ranch. It was called the Battle of Blue Springs. That's where the North turned the South back. And all the people who murdered my twin and kidnapped me were all Confederate generals in the Confederate Army in 1957. On the day Admiral Byrd was murdered, and my mother was his nurse in the Navy. My father served with Kennedy, and one of my murdered wives, she was murdered twice. Her father served with Kennedy in the Navy in World War II. And my uncle was Admiral Byrd. So I'm related to all the kings of Europe via Admiral Byrd's family. Baker is my family because that was Ava Gardner's mother. Bill Gates is my family. Joe Jacobs of IBM, I married his daughter. She was my first marriage. I divorced her in 1969. And I married two more times. I divorced my next wife because she was an Apache Indian and she always cheated on me with other men and women. And she would tell me right to her face she was having sex with other people. And her father was a state policeman who allowed her and her brother to sell drugs to renegades and outlaws on his property. I divorced her the last time she told me she was having sex with other men. And her family had tried to murder me 3 times. So it was easy to divorce her. And my daughter, who was a Taurus, she was murdered as I sat in L Brooks Patterson's office, trying to talk to him about Osborne and Anderson and Andrews and Wallace and Long and Darrell Hall. She was murdered with 4 more of the kids in my family in 2 states, Indiana. They murdered Harris in Indiana, and that's my mother's family. And it just seems really strange to me that Judith Baker lives with the family that murdered my twin. And Trump's election committee was Osborne and Stone. Stone cut the bone out of my foot as torture without any medical training as JFK was murdered. And my twin was brought back from California with the Sirhan little girl and put in my kindergarten class for 1 day, and then he was dead. Oh, I know all these things fit together, like Jackie Kennedy dying on DuPont's horse, and DuPont stealing my trademark with McMahon and Claire Cummins. And I know that these things aren't coincidence. I keep repeating these murders. In my lifetime, 5 Duncan kids were murdered as JFK was murdered. They told you that they ate arsenic sitting at the kitchen table, and Mr. Duncan was my friend all my life. And I knew him and his kids, and they didn't eat arsenic. They knew it was poison. And then at that time, you got arsenic and old lace, and my family is Christie. And Miss Christie and Gonzalez, Mrs. Gonzalez, my mother's sister, and Marguerite Gardner, My stepbrother, they all stole my inheritance. My grandfather had left me an inheritance. And my second wife was a pedophile. She was having sex with me before I turned 18. Her mother was trying to have sex with me before I turned 18. And her cousin had married my brother-in-law to my first wife as he ran Fort Knox. He was a captain at Fort Knox, and he was a DI at Fort Knox during the Vietnam War. And she tried to have sex with me when she was 30 and I was 15. So my wife's whole family were pedophiles. And then they stole my horse and tried to murder me, just like Osborne had done when I was 4 years old and murdered my twin. And all of this is true. In Tennessee, I owned a ministry with Johnny Cook, one of Willie Nelson's guitar players. And CBS had murdered my attorney on his way to file my wife's murder charges in Johnson City with the district attorney. And then Johnny Cook made me a partner at the ministry and didn't give me a paycheck for 3 years. So they stopped me from buying another attorney as they murdered my attorney on the same day they murdered my wife, Victoria Mellon. And she was born in Pennsylvania, where the third plane crashed and my twin's body was thrown on 9/11. And they had to hide all that $3 trillion of theft in every country on earth from Bottomline Publishing. I was an ASCAP BMI publisher with a federal license to publish in every country on earth. Americans caused 9/11 with Britain, Germany, and France. It was never Muslims. I had a civil rights case against the Groves family because they helped steal my trademark with DuPont and Webster and Claire Cummins, who was Milky the Clown. And they had painted my family's patents, the milk trucks my family was making. I was Fuller and Gardner, and Fuller and Gardner made Hollywood after my mother's family made the United States. And it was over $3 trillion of theft from my business, Bottomline Publishing. They had to hide the receipts. My civil rights case was in the Pentagon office they blew up, and it was against the Army engineer, Groves, who wasn't an attorney and was appointed as an attorney by a judge in Troy, Michigan. And they were not an attorney. They hadn't passed the bar, and they weren't an attorney. And that attorney left a misdemeanor, or not a misdemeanor, a felony on my record. And the judge told me, this is not a felony, this is a misdemeanor. But because I opened up a case because they had helped steal my trademark, Bottomline, she never changed a felony to a misdemeanor. So I can't own a gun. And I'm George Washington's family and President Jackson's family, Bill Gates' family. And this has been done to me all my life by L Brooks Patterson, Sheriff Hackle in Warren, Michigan. He was a dog catcher. He tried to put me in a dog cage and arrest me. And he wasn't even a policeman. He was a dog catcher. Because my band was practicing in a basement, the Bottomline band, and we were performing at Gene's nightclub called Cupid's Den, and it later became Sherry's. When I moved to California, after 3 of my wives were dismembered and murdered, 2 of them twice. One of my wives was in a wheelchair when they murdered her twice. They cut her ears off and slit her throat Halloween Eve. As a state policeman from South Carolina, filmed it, never filed murder charges. He was in charge of protecting my wife, and they murdered her Halloween Day after cutting her ears off. And her advocate's phone, who was Walters, Mrs. Walters. And if you remember, Walter Cronkite and Barbara Walters covered JFK's murder on CBS. And CBS in the White House with Obama, Major Tom Garrett destroyed my income at eBay as they murdered my attorney and my wife. And all of this is true. And to date, in all these murders, 5 Duncan kids, all the Oakland County child killings, my twins' murder, my mother's whole family being murdered, 4 of my wives dismembered and murdered, 2 of them twice. One was in a wheelchair when they murdered her. Her own doctor put her on a pill without telling her it would destroy her heart and her kidneys for no reason other than he needed a commission check. And that was in Greene County, Tennessee. And he was a Army doctor, as I had a civil rights case against an Army engineer in the Pentagon who built the Pentagon. He murdered my wife, a friend of a friend in Vietnam. My own brother raped my fiance in front of our 5 kids as I worked. And when I came home at 2 o'clock in the morning from work, he kicked 3 of my teeth out at my front door after raping my fiance. And my fiance didn't want to put him in jail, so we put him in a mental hospital, and he got some help. And then she and I split up, and we never got married. So I've had 2 fiancés murdered by police, hired as hitmen, 2 wives murdered by state and local police, hired as hitmen, by senators. I brought property from Trump's tax attorney, Mr. Mazar, and the whole property was Republican Senate selling illegal guns to Apache Indians in Mexico who were drug dealers. And they were taking drugs in return and selling them in Michigan to the auto company workers. Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, all the auto companies were there. And the drug dealers were all pharmacists. And when they put me in jail for turning this drug trade in, I went to jail for a year. And the FBI turned a blind eye to it, and Hollywood made movie stars out of all the drug dealers. And all of this is true. And this has nothing to do with Greg Bowe. Greg Bowe is an author I met who wants to tell my truth to the world. And this is all truth. I was raised to be a priest in a Catholic church. I didn't become a priest because my first wife, who was the mayor of East Detroit's daughter, raped me. She was 21, I was 14. She came back a month later, told me she was pregnant and wanted to murder my kid. I told her, I will marry you. I got 2 jobs, married her. And then I walked in and she was having sex with a homicide detective in front of my daughter. I didn't divorce her for that. A year later, she tried to stab me in the back with a butcher knife, and she pushed me down 2 flights of stairs while I was carrying toolboxes to my second job. And I had come home and I had made my kid and her dinner as I went to my second job. And she never worked. All she did was stay home and have sex with homicide detectives in the city of Warren. And that homicide detective was supposed to be protecting me because 2 men had tried to murder me when I was 16. They overdosed me on drugs and left me underwater and stole my car. And then they went to an airport and stole a plane to pick up drugs. And I'm going to end this video here. And every word I have said in this video is truth. I don't lie to people. I was raised to be a priest, and I was raised at a ministry, and I never quit the job. And I own the magazine, Gospel Notes magazine, even though the minister never gave me a paycheck. And we supported 2 food banks and 2 housing for homeless people. With that magazine, I ran. And I do not lie to people. I found 2 of my wives murdered, revived them with CPR, gave them CPR. Police had murdered them with bikers selling drugs. The entire police department in Greenville, Tennessee went to jail for selling drugs. Then this is 12 years later in Johnson City, where they murdered my wife a second time. The sheriff was taking extortion payments and hiding rapists. And my wife was sodomized in a hospital. Her ears were cut off and they slit her throat Halloween Eve as a state policeman from South Carolina, Senator Graham State, filmed it. He had cameras on her. He recorded and filmed it. And he tried to tell me I murdered my own wife. And I saved her life. And I hadn't gone to the hospital after he told me I murdered my wife. I didn't go to the hospital. And her advocate's phone was used to scream a judge who let a guy named Shovel out of jail in Michigan. And those bikers made a biker club at the end of my street in the middle of nowhere in Greene County, in Mossheim, Tennessee. Murdered 2 of my wives. They would run a shovel around their bedrooms on a brick wall. And every time I called the police who were selling drugs with them, they told me it was my aluminum gutters. And if you take a shovel and run it around a brick wall, it rings. Aluminum doesn't. And I heard the shovel myself at 2 and 3 in the morning. And they did this every night for a month, and then they murdered my wife. And the police in Greene County never filed murder reports on a dismembered, murdered woman who was murdered twice. My other fiance, I bought that Civil War ranch for, came from Menominee, Wisconsin, and police kidnapped her out of her Head Start CPS office as she protected a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old from the porno industry. They were flying them off the Great Lakes in seaplanes to California and selling them in gay bars. A wrestler from the WWF was paid $250,000 by the FBI, and he murdered Victoria and her 12-year-old son. They were also selling to gay bars. And I've known this all my life because Osborne and Anderson and Andrews and Wallace and Wong and Daryl Hall were trying to put me and my brothers on planes when we were 4 years old and sell us in gay bars. And they tortured me. They would take me and tie me to a toilet in a basement, in Osborne's basement. And now you have Osborne school system on Vance Street, which is Donald Trump's vice president. Stone cut the bone out of my foot, and Osborne murdered my twin and tortured me and had gay sex with me. Judith Laurie Baker lives with Mac Osborne. These things are not coincidence. And as I sat in L Brooks Patterson's office, 5 kids in my family were murdered in 2 states at the same time on the same day. And he never filed murder reports. And 2 police, 2 sheriffs in Tennessee never filed murder reports on 2 women murdered twice. And they said they were just going to leave it up to God. And the other one said it's not his fault, the government is corrupt. And they never filed murder reports on 4 of my wives or on my mother's family. They were all murdered at church. The only reason my mother lived is she was on fire, thrown out of the car into a ditch of water, and the ditch put the fire out. And she was burned over 17% of her body. And she lived. And they went back and killed all the kids in their own yards after murdering my mother's entire family at church on Clinton Road. And if you look at Jeffrey Epstein, Elon Musk, his mother, took over the cover of Maybelline magazine when my first wife was murdered. Her sister was on the cover. My family owned Maybelline magazine, Harris Publishing. Patents for vans, milk trucks, buses, the Fuller transmissions and semis, and the geodesic domes were stolen from my mother as her family was murdered at church. My publishing license was stolen by the FBI, DuPont, and McMahon as they murdered my wives and kids. $3 trillion of theft. I had 30,000 entertainment contracts. I put up one, Send in the Clowns. On the day I signed it, they murdered my cousin in Florida, Marlene. At the front door, she ordered a pizza and a clown come up and shot her in the face. As I signed the contract for Send in the Clowns, it was worth $87 million. I was in New York. She was in Florida. Later in life, I lived at Hemingway's house, and then I lived next door to Burt Reynolds. In Tennessee, I lived next door to Dolly Parton's father. And I had entertainment contracts in every country on earth, collecting royalties and distributing them to the artists. I rewrote the Berne Convention with Ted Kennedy in the Senate and House of Representatives. I posted all these documents on Facebook, and people still call me a liar. And they tell me to forget about all these murders of kids and women. And there are over 100 murders that are unsolved because police didn't even file murder reports, and the news didn't even report the murders. My 4 wives never even got an obituary, and they were dismembered and murdered, 2 of them twice. No obituaries, and this is because Fox is from England. CBS is Canadian Broadcasting. CNN is run by the BBC. Senator Graham runs Channel 4 and WWJ in Detroit when I was kidnapped and my twin was murdered. No news. They covered it all up. The Barr family and Osborne ran Senator Graham's TV station, and they covered up the murders. And there's no lie in this. And I'm looking at the White House now, and I'm seeing it full of criminals. And none of you Christians, you don't care about murdered kids or women in your own country. And I know this for a fact. And I'm going to end this video right here.